Paul Kagame is such an interesting figure in the African politics. He's such a strong president for such a small country. I'm sure if Rwanda was a big nation in Africa and had so many natural resources such as other countries in Africa, Rwanda would have been far much the strongest country in Africa. So many people love Paul Kagame and so many people hate him. I mean, I go through the same phases myself. Sometimes when I look at him, I look at him and I'll be amazed and I say, wow, what a strong president, what a man this is. And on the other hand, obviously, the controversy surrounding his involvement in the Congo. We need leaders like Paul Kagame. We need strong leadership such as Paul Kagame. I mean, I would say Paul Kagame is the Putin of Africa. He is strong in as much as he is controversial in certain things that he does. And obviously the question of democracy in his own country, which we can argue and say, but sometimes democracy has proven, especially as defined by the West, has proven to have failed us in Africa. And somebody said if China was a democratic nation, they wouldn't have managed to achieve what they have achieved in the past 30 years. No other country in the world has ever achieved so much growth and so much success such as China in such a short period of time in the history. And perhaps this rapid growth that China has achieved in the past 20 years is attributed to their kind of governance, which is not democratic. When they make a decision without democracy, which means there's no bureaucracy, it is carried out right away, and everybody is required to be behind it. The one China policy, everybody must stand with the decisions that the Communist Party makes. Perhaps that's what helps them achieve the success they have achieved in such a short period of time. And the same can be argued with Paul Kagame. I mean, he has done some great things in Rwanda. Rwanda is developing for such a small country. It is amazing what they have managed to achieve in such a short period of time as well. So many people would argue and say it's not democratic. Maybe the system of democracy doesn't work. So we cannot force every country to take on the same kind of governance. So maybe the system that he has chosen is the one that works for him, especially if we see tangible results. I mean, the man is patriotic to his own country. If whatever he is doing in the Congo, looting the minerals, is for the development of Rwanda, we gotta give it to him for being patriotic to his own country. Going into another country, being as controversial as he is, engaging in wars in order to develop his own country. The unfortunate thing is, in Africa, other leaders are not like him, are not as patriotic as he is. They care about themselves and their self-enrichment, and they're disregarding the people and the people of their country. So perhaps if we had more leaders like him in Africa, we would have developed. Africa would have been a great continent. So many people also think that Paul Kagame is a Western puppet. I do not think so. I think the man stands by himself, for himself. He speaks against the West every single time. As we are going to see now in this great interview, Paul Kagame raised so many critical points that we ought to listen to.
That you woke up that morning and there was a coup in Gabon. And when you look at the coups that are happening, what do you feel is driving? I know each one of these is different in its own way, but what do you think the primary drivers of this political instability are?
For me, it's very simple. And, well, it stems from the fact that the world doesn't learn lessons. As you see, people don't even learn lessons about what happened in our country. What is happening across the countries where coups have been taking place, people should be asking themselves, are these coups just happening, or they're happening for a reason? And that is something that maybe has been ignored in the past for many years and hasn't been addressed. And that is really, what do you do for the development of these societies in these countries? And people have come to take it for granted that Africa is poor and therefore it must remain as such, which is not true, because Africa is actually very rich, both in terms of natural resources, human capital, you can name it. I don't think there is any geographical space in this world that is so endowed with such things to build on as Africa. But in the end, it comes down to governance. How is Africa governed? How do countries govern themselves? And how, if they are doing that, are putting their people at the center of everything that is being done. So in the end, when you see a coup happening and ordinary people move onto the street and are happy, jubilating because of that, it tells you something. It's not just a coup that people should look at and say, well, this is the beginning, this is the end. There is that story behind.
As Paul Kagame just mentioned now, I mean, if you listen to that point, the problem that we have in Africa is the leadership that does not focus on the people. At the center of the governance is not the people, it's their selfish interest. If they could focus on the people drives, the needs for the people drives every agenda that they have or the decision that they make, then we would never have so many problems. Africa wouldn't have been where it is today. If the people are ignored, there is always going to be instability. The end result, the consequence to ignoring the people is instability, because you cannot rule the country and do whatever you want. At the end of the day, somebody is going to raise up to you. And that's why we end up having all these coups in Africa. If African leaders could change themselves and think that at the end of the day, they need to put at the center of their governance the people of the countries that they serve.
But there is another question that must be raised. All of these, for example, developed countries who are heavily present in every country on our continent, doing all kinds of things, teaching people democracy, human rights, freedoms. Then in the end, exploiting natural resources of the continent, making a lot of money, whether it is through companies or whatever is taking place. Sometimes countries, are playing their part directly in this exploitation of these natural resources that should have brought wealth to our countries. So one would ask, so why are you there for 50 years and you are doing all kinds of things, business, all kinds of transactions? For you, you get better for it, but the people of countries where you are doing it remain impoverished, if not even getting worse. So this is a question that...
Is that to the French? Is that to the Belgians? Is that to the Americans? Is it the Chinese?
All of them, absolutely. Why? Why would you be doing so things worth billions, tens of billions of dollars?
Do you think there's a kind of neo-colonialism going on now in Africa?
I think there is just total confusion. From the beginning, I think colonialism never ended, really. It just changed forms. But I can't also blame others just for it. I think we need to take responsibility ourselves as Africans. Why do we accept such a things to happen? Why do we have almost everything and that works to benefit others more than we benefit from them? There are different ways of correcting that. Why don't we do that? So, I mean, sometimes you may complain or you may blame the exploiter, but even the exploited should be blamed.
Colonization never ended. There you just heard it, Paul Kagame mentioned it. Colonization actually, in actual fact, did not end. It just took a different form. Just took a different shape. We are still colonized in so many ways. Our economic activities, we are not independent. Africa cannot provide for herself. Africa cannot govern herself. Africa depends heavily on foreign aid. Africa depends heavily on foreign direct investment, which in the end leads them to make demands on us and tell us what to do. Our wealth is taken away from Africa, taken overseas as raw materials, as natural resources, and get developed there and benefits the European countries and the Western countries and the Chinese. But us as Africans, we cannot do it for ourselves. So we are still colonized. There is no independence in Africa. We are controlled. And he speaks to the fact that we must also take responsibility as Africans. Yes, we do have to take responsibility. The colonizer and the colonized, they are both playing a role here. The abuser and the abused have 50-50 responsibility in the action. They are all participating. You as the person who is being abused, you're being abused because you are weak, because you cannot stand for yourself and you cannot defend yourself. If somebody comes from if your neighbor comes and rapes your children and rapes your wife and you do nothing about it, yes, we can point that fingers to that guy and say he's a moron, but at the end of the day, you as a father, you are also weak. You are also to blame, because you could have resisted, you could have defended your family. And so as Africans, all this that is happening to us, it's also our fault, because we cannot defend our own sovereignty, we cannot stand up for ourselves, we cannot develop our own countries, we cannot govern ourselves properly. So who is to blame for that? We have to take the responsibility.
America, the United States, other nations in Europe are trying to up their game. They're worried about China's influence. How do you see Western influence now, both in the continent and in your own country?
Well, this is the question. I think we have partly answered. There is going to be Western influence, or there's going to be some other influence. But it's going to be minus African influence. So meaning...
So it's a zero sum.
So this is what it looks like. Sounds like, because other people have influence, Africa doesn't have influence. So that means Africa is just there to be influenced by, and then, of course, the fights that go on over the continent, for very obviously for what the continent has. I think my take on that is it should challenge us African leaders and Africans generally. We can't permanently stay in this position of a victim. In the end, by the way, when those powers that have influence, whenever they want, they turn Africa into perpetrators.
He also raised such a critical point here when he speaks about the Western influence. At the end of the day, everybody else is influencing, but Africa has no voice, has no influence, because we have weak leadership. We are weak people. We do not stand for ourselves. We do not build our own infrastructure. We do not build our own economies to become a significant force in the world. So everybody else is gonna keep on coming and do whatever they want in our continent on top of us, and we have nothing to say. We cannot stand up for ourselves. This is a big challenge, I mean, that has been thrown at our hands by this man, that we ought to have our own power, our own voice. We have to build ourselves and become significant so that we can also be listened to. Not that everybody comes and do whatever they want to our continent and we just go with it and we just run with it. We allow it to happen.